On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Kris Shinn. He is the VP of Engineering at Consensus. We're going to be talking about scaling a single focus engineering team, well, to a broader or different type of engineering team. I think there's different areas we could take the conversation in, but specifically what we're going to be talking to Kris about is the impact on the engineering leaders, the impact on the engineers, how you deal with that tribal knowledge, different people who are comfortable in different size organizations. We got a lot to cover, and I'm excited to have you on, Kris.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I guess before we kick it off, let's get two things out of the way. One is tell us what Consensus does, and then you are the VP of Engineering. What are some of those responsibilities that you deal with?
Sure. So Consensus is a blockchain company, and we focus primarily with Ethereum and the Ethereum ecosystem. Now, we do a lot of things within the Ethereum ecosystem, from like consulting with enterprise companies to a more product-focused side of the company. The product side divides into two sections: consumer-facing, called MetaMask. If you've ever connected to the blockchain, you might have heard of the MetaMask name. And the infrastructure side, Infura, which provides JSON RPC and connectivity into Ethereum as a software as a service business. As VP of engineering at Consensus, I manage the Infura side of the company.
Awesome. Well, definitely a space that is constantly changing, and teams are shifting and growing. And I guess we came up with this topic because we talked about, obviously the growth of the company and your experience and background. And we kind of talked about as a team grows, and sometimes when you have a really small team you're managing and it does grow and it moves from, hey, this is a single focus engineering team to something else. I guess before we start, just to make sure everyone knows what we mean about single focused engineering team, can you just kind of start there and tell us what that means to you?
Sure. So single focused engineering team essentially to me means that you have one team, like say between 5 and 10 people, that are focused on a single product or a single aspect of a product. As that product gets product market fit and becomes more complex, you're bolting on new functionality, maybe you're expanding into different verticals, that product necessarily gets more complex and you end up hiring more. And so you're not really single focused anymore. As a company, you're focusing on a lot of moving pieces. And the challenge comes when the engineering team has to expand to cover all of those pieces. It starts to get complex.
Let's talk about that. So it's going to expand. It's going to get more complex. So I'm going to let you explain, but we're going to go from single focused engineering team as you're hiring to address future growth and more features. What kind of team are we kind of talking about? I guess what has been your experience with that single focus team? What are some of the options of how a team can reorganize itself to address some of the growth and changes?
So one way, when it's very early in a team's life cycle, you tend to hire more generalists, right? That those first 5, 10, 15 hires tend to be people who can be full stack, understand operations. I manage a SaaS business, and so part of what we do is not just software, but it's the running of that software and the operations of that software, right? So the people we tend to hire early on can cover all of those aspects. They tend to be utility players and can kind of jump around and tend to like that kind of ownership. As we started scaling, what you end up happening is you start getting more specialties, right? So people that maybe don't always just focus on building the application, but people that focus on DevOps. And so you start splitting the team across various specialties. Maybe instead of full stack developers, you're trying to get people that are more UX engineers, people that have a specialty and focus on the website or the web application part of it. And you have people focusing more on backend that may not have the skills to work on the website, right? And so you tend to get sort of more focused, what I would call function focused, I suppose, versus people that can build, that are looking to have like wide impact and just have their hands in everything.
And I guess, and I appreciate that. That's a great starting point to kind of explain both those aspects of single focus and where a team can grow to. And I guess there's going to be change as the company's growing, teams are expanding, both on the leader and the engineer. And I guess let's stay with the leadership side, and then we'll dive into the individual contributor side, or the non-leadership side. So as this team is expanding and going from a single focused, and it's broadening out, becoming more specialized, what's the impact on the leader? Because obviously a leader that's also managing that type of group that's more full stack, that has a lot more responsibility as an anchoring team, that leader has to evolve, or what happens to that leader?
That's an interesting question, because I think the leader's focus shifts, right? Managing a small team, there's its own challenges, of course, but I think it's easier to think about like as a single threaded team, like what we're working on, what we're producing. The team size is small enough to where you don't have to worry about siloing necessarily in information context and things like that. As the engineering team grows, what I found myself looking at is, instead of focusing on, okay, what is this quarter? What are we aiming to do from a specific product level? I found myself thinking about three specific concerns, right? The technical side, the human side, and sort of the middle part that binds the two is the information context. And so as a leader, most of what I'm thinking of, like, are the teams focused correctly? Is the right information getting sent to the right people, so that they can do their job? And how does all of that come together within the technical manifestation, right? So it's thinking a bit more abstractly. Whereas previously I could focus on, okay, what's shipping next? How do we get there? What are our blockers? And it's a little bit more oriented, say, to project management and product building. As we've scaled the teams, like, the leader has to go through this thing of, now, like, how do I manage this complex organism that used to be 10 and maybe now it's 50?
And obviously those are different. That could be a different skill set. You have to, as a leader, you need to grow that skill set, or the capability to grow that skill set. As you've kind of seen teams go through the process, and you get to the point of evaluating whether someone is the right leader to be now responsible. What they were for 10, now they've got to manage 30. Seems like a pretty big step. How does the org evaluate if that leader is able? How does the org kind of look at that? Because obviously, if they're not, then the question is, who does the job? And do you bring somebody in from the outside?
I think it's something that can organically happen with leaders. I can't remember the name of the book, so this might be actually something that we go back and re-record. But there is a book that describes from the growth of a leader, right? From a team lead, project technical lead, to managing a team, to being a director, to being CTO. And honestly, that path requires pretty explicit knowledge of what's below. What I needed to do as a team lead or as a leader of a small team, I knew all of those technical skills that I needed to have. And so, like, as the team grows, I'm looking to cultivate and manage those leaders, those sub leaders within my teams. And I think that, like, growing into any role, it's a really difficult, it's not without its own difficulties, and that those difficulties cause us to grow and stretch and become these leaders, right? We can't become the leaders without the challenge. And so, really, it's managing that growth size. I think the rate at which we grow, to where I'm not going from managing 10 individual contributors to all of a sudden managing 10 managers. It's more of an organic process where I can start to exercise those muscles within a smaller context, maybe with just 2 or 3 leaders, right? Maybe that's a team size of 20. And then as we kind of grow and get complex, then it's really about managing the managers and understanding how everything is working together, right? I think it's definitely possible. I think, to your point, like, when do you go and hire an outside leader? Is if you have people that either are struggling to grow into that, or you go through this explosive growth where it's like you go from 10 to 100 within the space of a few months, that might be worth considering bringing on an external leader to help organize and bring that capability to the organization.
And I guess well, let's say you do, and I mean, obviously, a little bit of a tangential point of this conversation, but just out of curiosity, let's say you do decide to bring a leader in from the outside, right? And obviously, you have people there. There are feelings and thoughts of capabilities, and obviously, somebody else is coming in from the outside. Not always easy. Seems like a tricky potential effect on team dynamics. Like, how do you handle that to make sure it's as smooth as it could be? I mean, it's not going to maybe be the easiest, but it's one you have to potentially bite the bullet on.
It's a change management issue, right? Like, how do you bring on that leadership, and how do you involve everybody that this person may be managing in that process, right? And it's never going to be perfect. I think getting the right, for me, like change management, especially as a leader, is identifying those people who have oversized leverage or oversized, they're looked on upon as like technical leaders, influencers of your organization, right? Those people, I think, are really critical to get on board early, and make sure they're comfortable. Like if you're bringing somebody from the outside, maybe they're part of the interview panel, right? And they get comfortable with the direction of like, how is this leader going to impact this organization? How is it going to impact me personally? And they can sort of act as the emissary to help manage the expectations on the ground, so to speak. But that being said, like with any change management, it always comes with uncertainty. It comes with doubt. It comes with fear. And so, however you can lay the information out, sort of lay out the introduction of that leader to kind of assuage those concerns, it'll help absorb. It'll help that new leader come on and blossom. The other side of it, as a new leader from the external coming in, I think that's really tricky. Is like, when do you start making this change? Like, I'm a very big fan of orient, observe, act, that kind of OODA loop. And so usually within the first 90 days, I would say for any manager coming in, you just want to orient and get the context of what has happened. And so like, you're not going against the grain or swimming against the current of what the current engineering team culture is, right? So you can sort of adapt and then help shape in the future. And that helps, I think, everybody accept that, that new leader. And some people may be burned out by it and they may decide to leave. And that's okay. I mean, that's a risk, I think, when you decide on taking an external leader that you take on, knowing that there is going to be some people that leave, and how do you address those critical positions or critical roles, so such that those are not the roles that are going to leave.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, from an engineering leadership standpoint, that I could see the dynamic obviously tricky. And then on the flip side, you have a team, when they were single focused, they're more full stack. They've got a lot of ownership. Everyone has a lot of visibility in terms of a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of dynamics there. But there's an impact on engineers. Obviously, they're going to sense, hey, the org is shifting, it's changing. My role, how's that going to be affected? Let's say I am more full stack oriented. They're asking me to, maybe specialize or move into a different role. I mean, all those different things that potentially disrupts the team as well. So maybe let's talk about the engineer and the impact on them, and the individual contributor, how they get affected, and then kind of what might be changing for them.
I think the biggest impact there is the biggest way that I've seen things change is around information context. Because before, as a small team, as sort of like a single focused team, you have all of the context, like every incident that happens, every bug that happens, everything that's kind of getting built. It's really easy to share that context. Now you multiply that by 5 or 6 more work streams, and all of a sudden people don't have that context anymore. And it feels a little disorienting, right? Like before, you knew what was going on with every engineer, with every initiative that you had. And as you start to reduce focus, you don't have that information context, and people miss that. I think, especially in the early days, it feels like I need to know what's going on in order for me to do my job right. Now, there's sort of this spectrum, right? Like that's a necessary thing, because on the other side of that, assume you did have all of the context. Now you need to understand like all of the details of like every team. And so, say you're in a microservices architecture, right? And that single-threaded team was managing 10 microservices. As you expand, that 10 microservices becomes 50 microservices. So the other end, you drive yourself crazy trying to understand how all of these microservices work and how they interact together. It's just an impossible task, right? Cognitive overload is kind of how it's described. And so I think that's a real struggle trying to figure out how much information do you need to know to feel comfortable versus managing that cognitive overload that you get as you're scaling the team. Some people take to it like pretty easily. They're like, great, I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm just focused on this one thing. And some people like that sort of small team feel and struggle with it more. And I think that personally, like if somebody is struggling with it, I try to get them to focus it more on the domain that they're assigned to, right? Like if they're in a specific service, I'm going to just talk in sort of general terms. If they're in service A and they used to handle like the concerns of A, B, and C, it's like, well, now you just have to understand what context A is doing or what service A is doing, right? You don't have to worry about on call. You don't have to worry about any of this other things, and try to illuminate how it benefits them in the long run. And that kind of works for some people, and for some people that struggle with it. I've seen people who just don't like operating in a big company, right? That feeling that you're no longer in control of the entire product, but you're more of a cog in the machine, so to speak. And they naturally will move on to smaller teams. And I think that's okay. Like stepping back as an individual engineer, as a person who's trying to grow their career, I think you have to find what it is that you really like to do, like what it is that you want to build, right? Some people want to build something bigger than themselves. Like think of like a Microsoft where you're like one of tens of thousands of engineers, but you're on a product that has a lot of impact and people get a lot of personal satisfaction from that. Other people, and I spent my life in startups, so I can relate to this other side. Other people like to have that small team, that 0 to 1. I build fast, loose, and I just want to get impact out there and like really have direct impact on people's lives that are using this product, right? And I think there's a spectrum. And for us to have enough insight, us as engineers to have enough insight as to what it is that we kind of gravitate towards should be encouraged. And I think that's okay, right? Like if you're a 0 to 1 guy and you're no longer on a 0 to 1 team, like do what makes you happy. Do what's going to affect your career in the most positive direction. You know, that's kind of how I think about it from the management point of view.
I guess a question. So a lot of startups are go through this. I mean, this is part of the process. I mean, I'm in a recruiting company. I talk to a ton of engineers that say, "Hey, you know, I'm leaving because I want to be a part of that fast loop. I want to be a part of that 0 to 1. I don't want to be in the big machine, or even 100 people is too big a company for me." Can a company design a team? Can they design the organization to accommodate those people staying? Because obviously you mentioned the tribal knowledge, right? I mean, these people are invaluable. They know the product from start. Is there a way that the team can think about that ahead of time and go, hey, listen, we know a certain amount of people aren't going to be there. Maybe it's a different role, but we need to find a way to keep these people, still challenge them in an environment they're happy with, and potentially find, or is it just, you know what, listen, as the org's changing and growing, we have to retain that tribal knowledge, we have to formalize it, and we can't just hold on to people that just might not fit, be around square and, you know, around peg, square hole type of situation?
I think there are things that companies can try to do. And honestly, I view sort of the agile movement, the 2 pizza team, the tribe and squad, those sorts of models as trying to emulate early startups, right? There's the concept of the empowered team, where it's like, you know, 7, 10, 12 people, like about the size of a small company. You have a specific mission and mandate that you're going after, and you have all of the skills and tools necessary as that team. Think of that team as a small startup in order to execute. Now, some people, I think the day to day of that style of a setup feels a lot like a startup, or it should feel a lot like a startup, right? You're working on a component or on an aspect of the system that has its own customers, be it internal or external. You have to iterate fast, you have to ship fast. And so the people that like that pace, I think, can stay within those companies. Now, I think that the issue comes with sort of the perception of the engineer themselves, of like how big of an impact do they feel they're making, right? Like you may have that sort of day-to-day style, that the kind of pace that you're used to as a startup, but you're not building the entire product anymore, right? Like maybe you're just working on a search aspect, or maybe you're working on a catalog aspect. And I think that sort of narrow view starts to wear on people, or it comes to a point where they're like, I don't have the impact that I once did. And I think that's the cognitive wall that we have to get over, or, as engineers. And again, I think that the more I'm in sort of like management, the more I feel it's a lot of mental work that we have to do, like on ourselves. And like, how do I coach people to either see that other side, or to realize, like, what is it that you want? You want to ship fast, you want to have impact, you have a larger impact but a smaller focus. Or do you want to have a larger focus and maybe a smaller impact with a newer company, right? Like those are the things that I think we have to navigate as people that work in scaling companies.
That certainly makes sense. And I guess the other component I was going to ask you about was, you mentioned, all of a sudden there's multiple work streams, there's a lot more people. We obviously touched on the tribal knowledge. What about the process part? Like if you kind of touched on that. I mean, if I'm an engineer, early stage startup, it might be Wild West for all I know. And then all of a sudden you have 50 people. There needs to be formalization. Like that process itself, aside from impact, which I completely understand, having ownership, I completely understand. I think there might be like this other component where sometimes people don't like that process. They like the chaos. They thrive in that edge of your seat. We're just slinging. I mean, I guess depends on the way to look at it. But how do you view that process component and kind of the impact on this situation?
I think that you have to have a good process component from the get-go. Like there are certain practices that I think you start, even as a small company. Maybe they're not scaled, and maybe they're not as quite as administrative, right, as you might have in a big company. But you can lay the foundation in a small company with really good practices, right? Documentation is something that you always hear, but like, what is documentation? That could be a lot of different things. It could be comments in the code, or it could be this like huge written body of prose that exists outside. The kinds of things that I like to see, especially smaller teams that are growing into big teams, that will grow into big teams, are things like the architecture decision review, or the ADR process, like GitHub has. That's a really good way to contain a lot of tribal knowledge, and to have a place where anybody on that organization at any time can kind of come in and see, how did this architecture evolve? How did the tech evolve at this company, and why were certain decisions made? Things like infrastructure as code. So you can kind of see how that evolved, and it's not quite, Jim over here clicked a few things in AWS, and now we have all of this running infrastructure, but only he knows how it's put together, right? Like things like that, I think, can really help create, what I call like paved roads at bigger companies, where it's like, okay, you sort of have less, you have more process, you have less freedom, but it's really easy, right? You have a lot of support. You have a lot of information that has been captured by the organization going through it, right? Like I think that there's, I kind of broke it up, right? The technical, the information context, and the human. This is where I think the technical and information context kind of merge. and where you can have a good engineering culture, right? Even as a small company, that'll help you scale.
I mean, I think that's actually really great insights. And I was kind of looking at the time. I'm like, darn, could keep going with you all day, but I know, I gotta wrap up with you. And I really do appreciate all your insights and views. And a question I like to ask all my guests is, if you could ask the future guest that's coming on to cover a topic or an area you'd like to hear more about on the show, what would that be for you?
So as we were talking about, sort of those three, the human, the information, and the technical, I think there's a lot of viewpoints and a lot of information on like how do you manage information context and flow through an organization, right? Especially as you're scaling. I'd love to hear people talk about managing information flow and figuring out the right way to get engineers the information they need.
Awesome. That's actually a really good one. And then secondly, if someone does want to touch base with you on anything, that you talked about or anything at all, what's a great way of getting hold of you?
So my LinkedIn profile is probably the best. If you find me, it's under Christopher Shinn, Kristofer Shinn. That's the easiest way to get to me, and I do check that quite often. So it's a good way to reach out.
Awesome. We'll be sure to link to that, and anyone that does want to reach out to you can hit you up via LinkedIn. Kris, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for sharing.
Awesome. Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. If you did find the episode, please share it with somebody else that might. That's how we grow. Like, subscribe, leave a review anywhere you are listening to this show. That's always appreciated. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.